Thank you once again. Welcome to our second session. This is part of a cycle of workshops that started yesterday. This is part of our project Museums to Go, which was possible due to ICOM's Solidarity Fund. This was carried out in Costa Rica by Accionarte and ICOM Costa Rica. And this allows us to learn more about virtual exhibitions and digitization of contents in our museums. So yesterday, Antonio briefed us on the theory relative to this subject. And today, on the second day, we'll go deeper into the experiences and how to implement such experiences. Antonio will share tools and applications available that he thinks are very useful to share with us. So thank you once again for your participation, and we will start our second day in this very important issue. And please remember to include your names in the chat, and this is the way we have to control attendance. So, Antonio, you have the floor, and we will continue. Thank you, Lauren. Welcome. We're very happy to share all these ideas with you in this very important field, which is the digitization of content, processes, and virtual exhibitions. Today, we will do the following. First of all, we'll go over the ideas shared yesterday, some ideas that will allow us to define frameworks with all the topics that we want to deal with. Basically, today, we'll focus on digital access to contents and virtual exhibitions and their components. We will continue with steps on how to create virtual exhibitions, some suggestions as to the steps to follow, and then we'll look into some tools that are available for museum professionals at a very low cost indeed. Tomorrow, on the third day, we will continue with a very short discussion or exchange. So please enroll, invite your colleagues to participate, because this dialogue tomorrow is going to be very important. It's going to be more of a discussion. We'll devote more time to the tools. Today we'll present 2 or 3 which I consider very relevant, especially due to their low cost and their efficiency. So next, please. Yesterday we mentioned all the changes that are taking place in the operational environment of museums, all the changes that come from outside, and how we interpret them through what we call the forces of change. The forces of change are these agents that produce variations in the external environment. These variations affect the work of museums directly. We talked about political changes, economic changes, social changes, technological, ecological, and legal changes. Next. Regarding the technological change forces, we mentioned that these variations have to do with the impact of technology on museums and the changes in digital communication, interactivity, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and global access to collections and contents. This last element is of our concern, and we'll devote more time to it as from now. Next, please. We also mentioned that any digitization process in museums has to do or includes basic components that we need to take into account and that we need to understand. We need to also understand where we stand vis-a-vis each component. These components have to do with contents based on collections, exhibitions, etc. It has to do with the public, the needs of the public, the motivation of the visitors that were face to face before the pandemic and after the pandemic, and during the pandemic it was a virtual public that can connect with our contents from anywhere. Another important component is technical and financial resources, that is to say, infrastructure, platforms with technology and financial resources that we need to acquire those tools. We also mentioned the importance of developing capacity and expertise within our teams to understand the change processes, to understand that physical exposure, contents and processes that take place when we develop a physical exhibition are not the same as those we need for an online exhibition or a virtual exhibition. Yesterday, we also mentioned some ideas for you to think about so that you could continue this dialogue within your own work teams. I invite you to reflect together on these contents, and then tomorrow, as we discuss as a group, we'll be able to share on the basis of your personal experience. Next, please. So closing this issue, we mentioned yesterday that what we really wanted you to take away after the meeting was to understand these forces of change and how these agents affected the work of museums. Another idea was that of renegotiating our relations inside and outside the museum, because teams are different, dynamics are different. This includes remote work, homework, and we have to rethink the digital strategy of our museums on the basis of what we've learned after the pandemic. We also learned that we have to collaborate with new stakeholders and identify new strategic alliances. And this leads to the need to experiment and explore new strategies to promote these exhibition contents. Next, please. We'll talk about digital access to contents. In this slide, you will see that there are 5 levels that go from the most traditional one, level 1, where we have most museums. They all have web pages, YouTube channels, social networks, Vimeos, etc., that allow them to provide digital access to a large number of visitors. This is part of interactivity, and this is what we call Web 1.0. Level 2 includes some museums that already have smart telephone apps and tablet apps, like British Museum, and some other examples that I will show tomorrow with specific names, so that if you want to, you can download those apps. Also bear in mind that as a result of the pandemic, there was a need to provide digital access immediately. However, the majority of institutions were not ready at the time of the pandemic. The contents were not fully completed so as to transmit them from a physical reality to a virtual reality. And that caused some apps not to work efficiently, so we had to learn lessons to carry on. Level 3 is more specialized. Not all museums have this possibility. Not even those that have virtual tours in Google Arts and Culture. But most museums can create their own tours to collections and visits through this platform. Level 4 has to do with virtual exhibitions. And this is the online representation of one exhibition that is devoted to a specific subject that has a concept and curatorship like a physical exhibition, though it goes from a physical presence to a virtual reality. And the fifth level has less participation on the part of museums, provides digital interactivity and immersive experiences. What do I mean by this? I mean that this is the level that requires more complex technology. So as you see, we move from a level 1, which is what most museums have available, to a level 5. So tomorrow, we'll probably work on the steps, and you will be able to identify where your own institution stands in the pyramid, and then you will see what you have achieved and what future objectives you have to achieve. Next, please. Virtual exhibitions allow us to turn a real reality into a virtual reality. This real reality could be an exhibition we have in our museum, and we want to complement it with a virtual representation, or it could be a virtual reality that is completely new, that has no previous physical exhibition. We need to understand something that's very important at this point. Real reality and virtual reality generate a physical environment and a digital environment in our museums. That is to say, when we think of exhibitions, when we think of subjects, when we think about curating that exhibition, depending on where we are, we need to take into account that the strategy is based on creating a physical and digital environment. You will see that it has narrative as a component, it has a concept, a list of collections, and it also has videos, images, and it also has a technological platform. So let us always think about this reality that is real and the one that is virtual by generating an environment that is both physical and digital. This is fundamental because the trend that we see today is that museums are having a more intense digital presence, and that digital presence cannot be isolated or divorced from the activities that the museum normally carries out. Therefore, in terms of exhibition content production, we have now to face a physical and digital environment. Depending on the specific situation of each of our institutions, it will be more inclined to the physical or more inclined to the digital, but what is important here is to understand this broad scope around which our exhibition will be presented.
También es muy importante entender que
It is also very important to understand that the experience generated by a virtual exhibit reality does not attempt to replace or replicate in its sensor experience the totality that is generated by the physical and on-site presence. That is to say, a virtual exhibit does not replace or eliminate the physical exhibit in the museum space. Pretty much the contrary, it complements the museum mission because it generates this digital physical environment, which also allows us to supplement learning activities of our public and of our audiences. Next. So, in terms of concepts, virtual exhibits can be defined as the digital or virtual representation of exhibits based on specific concepts or ideas. So virtual exhibits have the aim of providing online access to exhibit contents and to provide more visibility, even global visibility to collections and exhibits in museums. This access, this digital access, is for all types of publics, regardless of their geographic location. Which are the advantages and opportunities and their constraints? So I've brought some ideas which, based on our experiences, are one of the most important. In terms of advantages and opportunities, virtual exhibits allow to have access to collections and objects that are not necessarily being exhibited. So, for instance, in Smithsonian, through virtual exhibits, presents 10 or 15 times more objects than those being exhibited through their 19 museums in the US. So obviously this gives us global access to all of these collections, to the whole spectrum of knowledge that is included in those collections. Virtual exhibits are accessible to all types of audiences, regardless of their socioeconomic position, disabilities, provided that they can be generated through computers. But they can be accessed by all types of audiences. This access, of course, supports democratic practices of knowledge exchange. It provides interaction, learning experiences to a much wider group. Another aspect that's also important is that virtual exhibits support the conservation of fragile objects that cannot be exhibited in physical spaces, or at least cannot be exhibited very regularly. This can be seen with national heritage collections, with objects that require a high degree of conservation and of preventive conservation as well. So virtual exhibits allow us to exhibit and provide access to that information, to those databases of these objects, while maintaining the conservation criteria. So in this sense, virtual exhibits are very interesting for national museums. For instance, the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico that has very excellent virtual exhibits. In terms of disadvantages and constraints, to take the exhibit contents from a physical space to virtual space to provide this global access allows us to put a new context to these contents. It allows us to revisit them, to rethink about them, because the communication channel is different and the audience we're accessing is also different. I want to invite you, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. And at the end of this presentation, we will be answering them one by one, okay? Next one, please. So, which are the components of this physical digital environment, which is very necessary for exhibits? Our virtual exhibits need to have the basic components, which are a narrative, a concept, and exhibit speech, which is, of course, responding to the needs of this digital environment, which is not necessarily the environment for which the exhibit was initially aimed at. So it's very important to have a narrative in terms of thinking of it as a virtual exhibit that will not allow for the physical interaction of the public with those objects. Also, we need to have a digitization strategy for objects. And probably this is one of the most difficult components and one of the most common ones in museums in Latin America, which is the low level of digitization of collections. Another component, which is a basic component, is to have 3D images and visualizations that will allow to easily create a narrative and a virtual tour. Of course, we need to have videos that will allow us to support on content and, most importantly, a technological platform that, according to our resources, to our needs, might be something that is outsourced or might be something that is done in our own museum. If we go back one slide, please, the previous one, this one. Thank you. I now want to emphasize the disadvantages and the constraints. As I said before, one of the major disadvantages is the low level of digitization of collections, and this is probably one of the major obstacles. Our museums do not have object digitization processes that are solid enough, that are robust enough. Usually, we just have a database records which are meant for administration purposes, but what we have is not usually something that allows us to show them in high resolution and to move on in terms of creating virtual content. Another disadvantage is the high cost of technological infrastructure for development. Another item is the access to internet as a minimum technical support for users. When we talk about giving global access to our collections, we really have very little control of who can access knowledge because ultimately they're available online. But in some countries, in some areas that are less favored in terms of infrastructure, internet access as minimum support for users can become a problem, and it might be a constraint or a disadvantage. This is something we need to take into account. And also, in terms of constraints, we have the technological skills and expertise that are not always available in our work teams. Here I have a question. Eunice Baez from Costa Rica asked, how can we connect the historical narrative with the audience? Can social media meet that role? Yes and no. Well, social media allow for a different level of communication to provide access to contents, or they allow us to have a platform to continue with that access. But that narrative, that storytelling is something that comes out of understanding which are our needs, of understanding what our constraints are, and above all, of understanding where we stand as a museum, which is our audience, before we start with a process of digitization and before we start with a process of creating virtual exhibits. Once again, virtual exhibits are somewhat different from physical exhibits in the sense that they give an even more general approach as opposed to what the physical space gives us. Let's think that when we have an exhibit in a physical space, it is supported by a series of events, guided tours, a series of conversations and meetings with the community, which allows us to be able to get to know our audience more. So how do we take that to the virtual space? We need to understand what the behavior is, how virtual audiences are receiving our content. And in that sense, Eunice, you're right, social media somehow provide a very general framework for this. However, something that we can do is to have a follow-up through the tools that Google has, such as Google Analytics, to somehow understand how this audience is behaving in a digital world through the internet. We can understand its demographic features. For example, we can understand geographic location, age, gender. We can know more about the education level, which are all criteria that are part of the basic follow-up that Google Analytics does. So something that we do recommend is to associate museum websites to these follow-up procedures that Google Analytics provides. So you will be able to understand better the behavior of the virtual visitor, of that digital visitor that is connecting from anywhere in the planet. Next, please. Do you have any other questions so far? So we move on. As we were saying, the issue of components, something that is basic for us to understand is one, the storytelling, that narrative concept that allows us to connect us. Maybe we need to go back one slide. Yes, that will allow us to connect with the physical and digital environment, because we also need to connect the content that provide for audiences that visit us in museums to this digital audience. So that physical digital environment I'm talking about also includes these 5 elements, which are basic for understanding how can we be successful when it comes to providing digital content. So one, storytelling concept and narrative speech, the digitization strategy, that's also basic. Then we will see another example of how we can begin a digitization strategy for collections. However, there are other tools as well. For instance, virtual exhibits and their tools even allow us to create virtual exhibits with our phones, with our tablets. We will then see a platform that will help us create all of this. Of course, the immediacy in that case, but also state-of-the-art technology in cameras, in our mobile phones, are offering many more possibilities than we had before some years ago. So these images that are reflecting our collections or objects need to be converted into 3D images, what we call digital twins. That is nothing less than the virtual 3D representation of a bidimensional object. So those digital twins are basically the 3D result of an image being converted from a 2D object to a 3D. Videos, those are also very important.
Abierto. Vamos a cerrar el teléfono vamos a cerrar el micrófono un segundito. Aquí, muy bien. Entonces continuamos. Entonces estamos en las plataformas tecnológicas. Esto es posiblemente el aspecto más intimidante de crear una exposición virtual, sobre todo cuando los equipos de trabajo son reducidos y pensamos en la posibilidad de hacerlo nosotros mismos dentro de nuestros equipos. ¿Cuál es la plataforma digital más adecuada? ¿Lo hacemos outsourcing, lo contratamos afuera o lo intentamos desde adentro? Mi sugerencia, basado en procesos que he visto en muchos museos, es que los equipos de los museos deben experimentar. Deben experimentar primero con herramientas de bajo costo.
Need to first experiment with low cost tools that are available for everyone. That familiarity with these processes of creating virtual exhibits through low cost tools is what creates an understanding within our teams. If we think about the teams that work within our museums, at which are in charge of an exhibit, from curators, designers, people who record data, conservators, photographers, etc. That's a traditional team. However, in a process for creating a virtual exhibit, we will see that there are roles that will become more critical and that are not necessarily so when we have physical exhibits. Which are those roles in this case? Photographer, the curator, that will have to make sure that contents, once the storytelling is adapted to a virtual environment, has to make sure that contents are maintained. But basically, we're talking about the photographer, curator, and people who at a technological level have the capacities to upload these contents, or who are simply in contact with external teams in charge of dealing with these processes.
Very well then. So now I'm presenting some suggestions. Suggestions on the steps to take in this process to create virtual exhibitions. This is based on our experience, and this is based on what we see is happening in all types of museums, not just art museums, could be history, science museums, technology museums, etc. But basically, the first thing we need to do is select the digital contents for the exhibition, images, videos, etc. Then start digitization of the objects to be included. Then evaluate and select the technological platform, create digital twins on the basis of bidimensional objects, moving into three-dimensional objects based on the contents of the exhibition, then upload them in the selected platforms, and after that, build the virtual reality spaces, like creating walls, adding colors, making something attractive, visually attractive, and of easy navigation for the users. Remember the KISS rule in English: keep it simple, stupid. That is to say, make it as easy and simple as possible. Keep it at a basic level so that all audiences have access. The other point is to install orientation points throughout the exhibition space to present narrative and to share the digital museum experience. Do you have any questions regarding the steps? Otherwise, I will carry on. Amelia Rodríguez says we need to highlight the case of the museum in Peru. 100% of its collection is digitized, and we have virtual visits to special parts. I thank you for your comment, Amelia. That is true. The El Arco Museum in Peru provides digital access in a wonderful manner. And I think that in Peru, we also have the Art Museum of Lima and others in the network. So tomorrow we'll focus on a discussion. We'll go into different websites to see what is available so that we can visualize some of these things. In addition, we also have the case of government institutions in Latin America. In Mexico, the National Anthropology and History Museum that provides digital access to many of its collections. Next, please. So in this case, I want to show you one example of a tool that is very important and easy to use. It's a tool that was created for regional museums in Europe and Latin America, funded by the European Union with the participation of the St. Andrews University. It's a manual for digitization of objects in 3D. Here we have a PDF version, and just allow me a second. I will ask, just give me 1 second. I want to share my screen with you so that I can show what this is all about. I'm going to share my screen with you. Can you see it? Yes, we can. Well, this is the manual for digitization in 3D. It's easy to read and understand. It's available in the link that you have in the chat. It includes selection of objects, preparing the teams, preparing photographs, creating models, etc. It also provides tools. For example, let's look at this. It provides tools and websites. It gives advice and very useful tips. This is a very interesting example. It deals precisely with one of the main obstacles we face in virtual exhibitions, and that is the digitization strategy. So I will no longer share my screen. And in the chat, just in case, I will include the link. Lauren already did it. Thank you, Lauren. And I'll take the opportunity to say that you will receive the PDF of all presentations and the links that are mentioned during the presentations when the 3 sessions are over. So you will get all the material afterwards. So let's go back to the presentation, Lauren, please. As I was saying, this is a tool, a manual, a best practice manual, which is excellent. And it is for you to create in a very simple way whatever digitization of objects in 3D you need. Next, please. This is another tool which I find excellent. I have used it myself. It's an app called Matterport. It's free of charge, This is for iPhone and iPad that allows us to generate 3D trajectories without the need of having a digital camera. This platform allows us to transform 2D images captured by the mobile phone into 3D images. Apart from that, we can also create these trajectories, which are virtual, from templates, for example, from previously designed formats, or to upload some of ours. Why do we like it? There are 3 bars here. The cost is low. It's not difficult, it's medium difficulty, I would say. As many other technologies, you need to go through a learning curve. It might seem difficult or complex at the very beginning, but as you move on, you get familiarized and it's user-friendly. They ask me if it's available for Android. Yes, it is. And permanence. Today, any project, any product generated in this platform has a permanence of 2 to 3 years, which is perfect because it obviously allows us to revise, as we do in the case of other exhibitions. We want to revise the dialogue with the visitors, the feedback from the visitors, that rapport we can develop with our audience that allows us to adjust when we plan future projects. That is why we like this application so much, Matterport. And now I'm going to share again with you what you can do with this. In the next slide, before we go into the, I'm sorry, Lauren, for changing my, yes. Let's see a specific example created with this tool. This is a virtual exhibition called Single Use Planet, a call to action from the artist of the Americas. This has to do with different positions vis-a-vis conservation, preservation, ecology. This is for artists in the Americas. This was organized by the Cultural Center of the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. So they have used Matterport. Here you have the link, and you can access the specific video and check this platform. However, I would like to share with you a few seconds to show you how easy it is to manage. I will share the screen with you now. Can you see it? So this is a product of such exhibition. Here on this corner at the left, we see a kind of a menu that allows you to look at the whole virtual tour where you see different points of the narrative. You can see the points here very clearly. We can play, turn it around, move it to one side or the other. We can explore the 3D space from this corner. We go into the entrance, and when you see this icon, this human body in red is the visitor. With that icon, we start moving around. The cursor becomes the visitor. This is the main entrance to the gallery from the Cultural Center of Inter-American Development Bank in Washington. So we go through the door and start visiting. With each click, I move, and there is a point of narrative reporting on the work. You can get closer, you can read the narrative, and these circles that you see on the floor represent the points where you stand for observation. This interactivity allows us to include content, like a description of the works of art, and also to move on, to continue moving. I can sort of walk and continue my tour. Here I need information about this piece of work, and this platform, this reality, was created with this app. We can see the text introducing the work of art. We can interact with them. So something very important to mention, we can really understand how the bidimensional images that we have acquire like a new meaning by using virtual reality that does not necessarily generate or create the same experience in the visitor. I make this point of clarification because I know this area very well. This is the entrance. This is the street. This is the main entrance into the cultural center. You go into the room when the gallery is open, but there is another entrance to the gallery that requires being in touch with other works of the collection. So your virtual tour will be different from the physical tour. So in some cases, museums have special areas for temporary exhibitions that are physically located in the buildings. After the visitor goes through the lobby or through other rooms that show collection works. And those narratives, those tours do not appear in virtual reality. So this is part of that new narrative, and we need to take this into account in order to understand how we can bring a physical tour and turn it into a virtual tour. We have a question here, Antonio. Maybe you can answer it now. When you say virtual reality, you mean that the exhibits can be visualized with a headset? Yes, they can be visualized with a headset, but that depends on the moment you create the virtual exhibitions. If you create them in this platform and in other platforms, there are possibilities to add an additional component, which will require glasses and other devices for 3D virtual reality. When I talk about virtual exhibitions, I refer to this other type. These realities that are built with the help of technological platforms, and not all of them include the specific characteristics providing visualization experience with goggles. But when we talk about virtual exhibitions, we are referring to exhibitions that do not exist in physical space. They are created with technological platforms. That's a very important differentiation. Thank you, Melissa, for your question. So most of these applications offer this additional component in case the museums have a possibility already or have already created contents that can be easily added to this kind of template or format, which is basic. So, well, basically, my purpose was to give you an example. I recommend you to visit this. I will close this presentation and we'll go back to the slide that we were discussing.
So
este ejemplo y otros
this example and other examples we will be seeing them in more detail tomorrow. Let's talk about what we will do tomorrow. Tomorrow, we will bring more examples and we will begin the session with those. We won't have a breakout session, but we will be connected all together. I will bring 2 or 3 more examples, and from there, what I hope is that with what we saw yesterday and what we saw today, we can somehow understand those ideas starting from these examples and to generate a discussion. So today, I would like to conclude by talking again about the forces of change under the lens of virtual exhibits now. So what is the impact of virtual exhibits in the environment of these museums? And here, this is where we have the forces of change. Where are the key points for us to understand how virtual exhibits affect or are linked with these forces of change? In terms of the political aspect of our museums, we want to reflect those discussions. We want to reflect the problems. We need to see whether it is a mission of our institution to do so. In this case, virtual exhibits also affect the economic force of change due to the resources that we need. The most important thing here from from the point of view of virtual exhibits are two. The social force of change and the technological force of change. Why? Because in the social force of change, as um, our audiences are changing, the needs and the capacities of our audiences are also different. So that is something that we need to really have in mind. We need to have a solid vision within our teams to understand how our virtual exhibits can help us or how they can consolidate the role of our museums from a social point of view. And of course, the technological tool, which in this case is the major change. Technology as a vehicle, as a key vehicle for communication and for exchanging content and knowledge for a public. So virtual exhibits have an impact in the mission and vision of our institutions, and in some cases, in the ecological forces of change, because many of our exhibits, as is one of the most relevant issues right now, deal a lot with sustainability. So, obviously, when we have a virtual exhibit instead of a traveling exhibit that will go to, let's say, 5 or 6 different exhibit sites, then virtual exhibits are much more sustainable than having to move that exhibit, which will require packaging costs, logistics, traveling costs, and it has a much higher impact in terms of sustainability and ecology. So with this, let's see the next slide, please. Next one, please. I think that we're going backwards. Okay, so with this, what we want is to open up the spectrum to introduce you to the use of tools. I invite you today to navigate this platform, to download this platform. Tomorrow, we will give you a list with further examples for you to take home. And if possible, try to download these applications and try to do some experiments so that tomorrow our conversation will have the possibility of including your feedback on something which can be so easy as to download an application and to create a virtual exhibit. This is just an exercise. What I think is interesting is to be able to listen to each other and to see how this can be implemented immediately. So tomorrow, Saturday, we will be here, even though it's Saturday, to share with you the presentation again. And with this, I will give the floor to Lauren to close the presentation. Thank you so much, Antonio. Today's class was really, really useful. And there are many things that I would like to ask today, but maybe we should leave them for tomorrow because I am a little I'm not so deft at using 3D virtual exhibits. So this is something I would like to talk about more tomorrow. So thank you very much. Let's meet tomorrow, same time, same place. And we will now be sending you an email with all the links, just in case you didn't have a chance to write them down, so that you can explore a little bit more before tomorrow's session. So thank you so much, Antonio. It was such a pleasure to be able to listen to you and to learn from you with everything that you have to share with us. And please, as for the others, please write down all your questions and comments for the session we will have tomorrow, which will be more interactive. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning to everyone, wherever you are. And meet you tomorrow. See you tomorrow. Thank you very much. And thank you. And I want to thank the interpreters too for having supported us and for so successful.